The story of the Samaritan woman at the well is really only half a story. It's pretty clear that the author of John's Gospel meant for it to be read alongside last week's story about Nicodemus. If we lay them out side by side, it's easy to see it was the author's intention that the reader contrast the two accounts. Last week's story was about a man named Nicodemus. This week we encounter an unnamed woman. Last week it was a clandestine meeting with Jesus in the dead of night. This week, Jesus' meeting is at a public well at high noon. And Jesus' conversation last week was with a member of the religious elite, a high-ranking Pharisee. This week, Jesus is having a conversation with someone most self-respecting, law-abiding Jews of the day would have shunned, a Samaritan. In fact, it seems a bit unusual that Jesus would have chosen to even travel through Samaritan territory. He's returning to Galilee from Jerusalem after having traveled there for the Passover pilgrimage feast. But most Jews would have traveled around Samaria, not gone through it. That's how tense the relations were between the two people. The history between the two groups is complex, but suffice it to say, both considered the other unclean. And so the reader may wonder why Jesus intentionally chose to travel home by way of Samaria. But remember, he has just finished telling Nicodemus that God so loved the world, and the world included Samaritans. And so that's why it was necessary for him to travel through Samaria. So while there, he encounters a woman who has been unfairly denigrated through centuries of Bible commentaries, which is typical. Most women are. Take, for example, Eve, who has been blamed for the fall of all humankind when she listened to the serpent and offered the forbidden fruit to Adam, who apparently had no choice about the matter. And Bathsheba, well, she has been portrayed as an exhibitionist who bathed on her rooftop, luring poor King David into the sin of adultery. And let's not forget about Mary Magdalene. The church has repeatedly cast her as a prostitute when nothing in the Bible supports such accusations. So it's not surprising to hear the character of today's Samaritan woman vilified by commentators. When Jesus points out that she has had 5 husbands and the one with whom she is currently living is not her husband, the self-righteous misogynistic preacher casually depicts her as a 5-time loser and a tramp, when in all likelihood, she was barren. She had either been widowed or she was divorced multiple times when the husband realized she would not be bearing him children. And the relationship between her and the man with whom she was currently living was probably a levirate marriage, where by law, the brother of the dead husband was obliged to take in the dead brother's wife. No, she wasn't a 5-time loser or a tramp, as you may have heard. She was a broken woman, a woman the townsfolk would have labeled as cursed by God, someone who knew the pain of whispered accusations, someone rejected and scorned by her own people, someone who would rather draw her water in the solitude of the noontime heat than to encounter the critical stares of others during cooler, more suitable times of the day. And when Jesus asked about her husband, I don't think it was with any accusation in his voice. Instead, he was gently ever so gently touching the raw edges of the painful truth of her reality. A heartbreaking truth. A truth that is revealed with her understated response. I have no husband. And I believe this broken woman was the real reason Jesus was sitting at the water well. He had been waiting on her. And so we have yet another difference between the story of Nicodemus and this woman. Nicodemus sought out Jesus, but here we have Jesus seeking out the woman. And maybe it was with her in mind that he would later tell a parable about a shepherd who left his flock to seek out a single lost sheep. If you are a woman who has not been allowed to share your gifts in the church, if you're a transgender or non-binary and you feel broken by the role the church has played in the hateful legislation that is being proposed, if you are a lesbian or gay man or bisexual or intersex person or asexual person whom the church has coerced into taking a quiet place of invisibility, if you are an elder with experience and wisdom to share, but you feel invalidated by the church, if you are a differently abled person who feels tokenized by the church, then Jesus is sitting at the water well and waiting for you to make your way to it. And he would like to have a conversation with you about the church. One similar in vein to the one he had with the woman in this morning's sacred text. You may have questions about a church that would treat you the way it has. Is this really the church that was ordained by God? Because if it is, then maybe it's time for you to just make a quiet or not so quiet exit. And Jesus responds by saying the same thing he said to the woman in verses 23 and 24. The hour is coming and is already here when real worshipers will worship God in spirit and truth. Indeed, it is just such worshipers whom God seeks. God is spirit, and those who worship God worship in spirit and truth. In other words, regardless of what the church claims, it doesn't have a monopoly on the truth. Near the story's ending, we read, "Then the woman left her water jug." It sounds innocuous enough. Maybe she was in a hurry, and in her rush and excitement, she left it behind. Maybe she simply forgot it. Lord knows I forget things when I have more than one thing on my mind. But why would the author include such a trivial detail in the story? Well, maybe it's not trivial at all. Because the word can also be translated as let go. And Bible scholar Caroline Lewis says that the woman is leaving behind more than just a water jar. She's in fact letting go of everything it represents. Lewis writes in her commentary on John's Gospel, she leaves behind her ostracism, her marginalization, her loneliness because Jesus has brought her into his fold. She leaves behind her disgrace, her disregard, and the disrespect she has endured to enter into a new reality, a new life that is abundant life. And so when the gospel writer pens, "Then the woman left her water jug," it may possibly be the most important sentence in the story. So today, Jesus is waiting at the water well for anyone who has been marginalized by politics, peers, or preachers. And he wants to clarify a few things if you're willing to listen. He knows you're dying of thirst, and so he's ready to quench that thirst, first by letting you know it's not important whether you choose to worship at Jerusalem or Mount Gerizim, or at Antioch Church or Metropolitan Community Church. The hour is coming and is now here, Jesus said, when what's important is not where you worship God, but rather how you worship God. And second, while Jesus welcomed the marginalized, the church has historically made a mess of it. And so Jesus invites you to let go of your water jar. Let go of all the trash and rubbish that's been heaped upon you by others. Let go of the identity that they have chained to you, and embrace the one that proclaims you as made in the image of God. Then your thirst will finally be quenched by the living water that Jesus offers. Instead of the water that leaves you parched and dry-mouthed, one offered by an institution that claims to possess a truth that would call you someone other than a beloved child of God. So leave behind your water jug. Leave behind the identity that's been forced upon you by a fear-based, manipulative religious institution, and embrace the one that quenches your thirst, one that the beloved child of God offers to all who would drink from it. Amen.